there's a form of midrash, a classic form of midrash in the Jewish tradition that it's a little bit playful. It's sort of a form of gamesmanship. It's called a petichta, where one opens with a verse very far away from the subject, from the Torah reading, from the subject at hand, and finds one's way back. And it was considered sort of fun for the community to kind of guess how it was going to find its way back. So I'm going to tell you up front the verse that this is going to connect to in the Torah. And then you'll see if you can figure out how we get there, and I'd be surprised if anyone does. But we're going to connect back to the second verse of this Torah reading, which reads, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amart alehem, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban ladonai, a person who presents an offering to Adonai, min habehema, min habakar, min hatzon, from the cattle or the flock, takrivu et korbanchem, they shall bring their offerings. That's the verse, okay? So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. All right. So I want to focus now on this Talmudic text that we talked about last night. And as I mentioned last night, this is a text that has some echoes of the Exodus narrative and the Seder, with Pesach. And those of you who watched the piece that I did for JTS that Stacy sent out, it was also a little piece of Talmud, a story in the Talmud that had echoes of the Passover story. And I think that when the rabbis do this, when they create a section of Talmud that echoes, and that intentionally, I think, calls to mind the Passover narrative, the Exodus narrative, I see it as a kind of oblique commentary or expansion on the lessons of that core definitive narrative of the Jewish people, right? Like they're evoking that story so that we'll think, oh, this is what part of what that story is about. This is why we're here, okay? So in this particular text, the connections are not quite as explicitly evocative as they are with the one I taught for JTS, but they're pretty strong. So as I mentioned last night, this is a Talmudic text from the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Shabbat, from 54b to 55a. And it begins, the section I want to look at begins with the very famous injunction that gets talked about a lot, especially by those on the left who are sort of social justice warriors, right? Which is the following. Anyone for whom it was possible to protest the sinful behavior, in brackets, right? That's what we're talking about, of the members of their household and did not protest, is held liable for the sins of the members of the household. And someone who is able to protest the sins of the town and didn't do so is held liable for the sins of the people of the town. And those who are able to protest the sins of the whole world and fails to do so is liable for the sins of the whole world. Sorry. And then it goes on, Rav Papa said, and those of the household of the Exilarch, who is the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia, were liable for the sins of the whole world. Excuse me, assuming that one who is in a position of authority like that has the ability to influence others and is therefore liable. Okay, that's the main text, and then we get to this little story about it that is a commentary on, well, what's the extent of that liability and when do we have to speak up and, what does this really mean? And it begins as follows. Rabbi Zerah said to Rabbi Simon, let the master, meaning Rabbi Simon, reprimand the members of the house of the Exilarch. right? You, Rabbi Simon, go to the most powerful person in the community and speak truth to power, because they're behaving badly, and you are in a position that maybe you can have some influence there. Rabbi Simon said to him, they will not accept reprimand from me. Rabbi Zerah said to him, even if they do not accept it, let the master reprimand them. Now, right away, we should be hearing, since Pesach is next week, a little bit of the echo of God saying to Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And Moses saying, he won't listen to me. And God saying, do it anyway. But here, right, God is not in the picture. These are human beings saying you have an obligation to speak out when you see wrongdoing. Now, how do we know that there's an obligation to speak out even when, according to Rabbi Simon's answer, it's not going to make any difference? They are not going to listen to me. Now, the Talmud brings a verse from Ezekiel. And the verse from Ezekiel comes in the context of a very harsh, terrible prophecy of punishment to the community of Israel because of bad behavior in our midst. Right? There's going to be a real price to pay now, God says. And in the context of that, we get a teaching that this was the only time that God ever changed God's mind after making a promise of good and then retracting it and saying, no, actually, I'm taking it back. They're going to be punished. What's the context? The verse from Ezekiel is the following. It's Ezekiel 9:4. Adonai said to him, right, to the prophet, pass through the midst of the city, avur, right, betoch ha'ir, betoch Yerushalayim, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set the mark of the letter Tav on the foreheads of the people who sigh, hane'enachim, and who cry out, hane'enakim, right? So ne'enachim and ne'enakim, on account of all of the abominations that are being done in her midst, within the people of Israel. That's the verse. Now, the verse itself echoes the Passover narrative, right? Why? Because the people who are crying out, first of all, that word anakah is exactly the word for us crying out in Egypt. We cried out and God heard our cry. So that's an echo. The avur, pass through, you can hear like, remember, I will pass through, right? And I will strike the firstborn of the Egyptians, right? We have that too. And then the marking is the mark here of protection. Meaning, who gets protected from this terrible prophecy? The people who are seeing wrongdoing and objecting to it, who are crying out, saying, this is wrong. Those people will have a mark on their foreheads and they will be spared. Echoing the mark on the doorposts, right? When we were in Egypt, and this destroyer will come through and smite the firstborn, but the people with the mark on the door will be spared. Now, a couple of things here. Note the flip of the Exodus narrative. We are no longer crying out against an outside oppressive force. This is an outcry within the Jewish people of violence. In Ezekiel, the word is Hamas. And abomination that we are perpetrating. It turns it inward, right? And it says, the Ezekiel text and the use of it here, the people who will be spared are the people who objected, who raised their voices. In case we miss the connection to it or we don't understand it, the Gemara makes the link to the plagues more explicit. It goes on to say as following. The Holy Blessed One said to the angel Gabriel, now we're no longer talking to Ezekiel, we're talking to Gabriel, go and inscribe a letter tav of ink on the foreheads of the righteous as a sign, so that the angels of destruction will not have dominion over them. And on the foreheads of the wicked, put a letter tav of blood, so that the angels of destruction will have dominion over them, right? This is a sorting process of who's going to survive this. And then the Gemara does something very strange. The Talmud imagines Midat Hadin, the attribute of strict justice, personified in this character, standing up and saying to God, Ribono shel olam, ma nishtanu elu me'elu. Right? We should hear, I hope, ma nishtana. It's not an unusual formulation of why is this different, but it's pretty evocative, right, of the Seder. What makes these different from those? Now that actually is a very shocking, startling question. What do you mean, what makes these different from those? We're talking about the righteous and the wicked. Of course they're different, right? Of course. What's the question? Right? How is strict justice saying, wait a minute, God, what are you making this so like, what's the difference? Right? And God voices what we want to think. In the Talmud, God is kind of our voice, and God says in response to the attribute of strict justice, these are completely righteous people, and those are completely wicked people. Wouldn't that be lovely, right? That's how we want to think. There are evildoers and there are righteous people, and we're usually putting ourselves on the good side. We want to see the world that way. And the attribute of strict justice says, not so fast, God. Like, note the challenge to the divine. God wants to be a little compassionate. Attribute of strict justice says, hold on a second, and says to God, Ribono shel olam, these people you're calling righteous, they had the power to protest, and they did not. Right? You want to save the righteous people, but there's an echo here, of course, of Abraham arguing with God too, right? Sodom and Gomorrah. You want to say these people are righteous, you're going to save them? Where were they when terrible things were being perpetrated? They could have said something. They could have spoken out. They could have protested, and they didn't, right? The attribute of strict justice is saying, right, in the famous quote, often erroneously attributed to Edmund Burke, all that is required for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. They're accessories to evil because they could have said something. Can there be a claim to righteousness if I witness evil and I do nothing to stop it? And God's response continues to be one of compassion, trying to spare the righteous, right? God says in response, it is revealed and known before me that even had they protested, the wicked would not have accepted reprimand from them, right? So God is saying to strict justice, you can't hold them liable for this. There really was nothing they could have done. They couldn't have stopped it. They wouldn't have been heard. I know that. And strict justice responds, you know that. Did they know that? Now, strictly speaking, that's a kind of legalistic argument, right? You can't plead as a defense a fact that you didn't know. How can you say I can't be held liable for not speaking out because it wouldn't have mattered anyway if you didn't know that it wouldn't have mattered anyway? As I said last night, I want to read it as much broader than that, right? That it's not just a legal defense. It's a challenge to a sense of helplessness that we may be inclined to indulge, or hopelessness, or a false sense of our own inefficacy, right? We're sure that nothing we could do would make a difference. And the attribute of strict justice says, don't be so sure. How do you know? Maybe it would make a difference, right? So that's the Talmud, and it is a riff in a lot of ways on not only the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but as I said, on the Exodus narrative, right? On those who engaged in civil disobedience, the midwives, Pharaoh's daughter, Miriam, and Moses, who directly rebukes Pharaoh, who speaks truth to power, who goes, as it were, to the Exarch and says, this is wrong. Ineffectually, as I said last night, right? Eventually God lets the people go, but not because of Moses. It's because of God, because of the plagues. Okay, that's the text. Now, I want to suggest that the Talmud is struggling in this story with a bunch of different things, and you may come up with more things that it's struggling with than I can identify. One is this question of collective responsibility, right? What are we liable for in society? We say, Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Vazeh. All of Israel are obligated for each other. Right? Heschel famously said, in a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. It's beautiful soaring rhetoric. Do we totally believe that? Like on some level, I want to side with God here, right? There seem to be forces that are so much bigger than we are. Are we really going to be held accountable for everything that happens? For everything that, that everybody else in our community does? That's a very harsh standard. And I think they're struggling with that, right? It's notable that God changes God's mind in accord with the attribute of strict justice, but it's also notable that God first takes the stance, come on, somebody has to be righteous. You can't hold it, right? You can't be responsible for everything. It wouldn't have mattered. That's number one. Number two is it's struggling with the question of human agency and its limits, right? On the one hand, it is very clearly saying hopelessness, helplessness is unacceptable. It is morally irresponsible to yield to the sense of helplessness in the world. It may be that ultimately what we do will not make a difference. But do we know that? We do not know that. And it may also be that it will not make the difference we think it's going to make, but it will make a different difference and is therefore necessary anyway. That's one side. The other side is, what about realism? Right? We have limited energy, we have limited time, and there is always the risk of causing further harm. We remember the challenge to Moses, right? Oh, a lot of good you did, now everything is worse, right? Pharaoh has made the burdens heavier. There is always that risk. There's a certain humility on that side too, we don't know. And it's struggling, I think, with agency and its limits, and arrogance and humility, right? Having the courage of our convictions, and also the humility to sit with not knowing on both sides, that we don't know the good we can cause, but we also don't know the harm we can cause. That's a challenge. The third problem it's sitting with, I want to suggest, is the question of truth, right? It's very easy to say, we have to speak truth to power. And we do. What is truth? Truth is complicated, right? And on the one hand, right, it is not easy to discern truth. We are all acting on incomplete information. And the challenge is, when do we hold back because of that complexity? And when do we need to say, this is wrong? It's just wrong. And whatever the limits of my ability to know, and that I have to take a stand and say no at some point, with all humility about the limits of the human capacity to understand. The reason that I think this is at stake is because the Talmud text continues, and they want to know about our text in Ezekiel, why the letter Tav? Why is Tav the letter that goes on the forehead to distinguish the righteous from the wicked? And a lot of answers are given. We have a bunch of different, because of course nobody knows, so they give a lot of answers, right? So one explanation is Tav is the beginning of Tichye and Tamut. You shall live or you shall die. That's a little bit forced because Tav is just the prefix that means you shall. So you could put that with any word, right? Another explanation in the name of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan has to do with the patriarchs and their merit. One says the merit of the patriarchs has ceased, Tama, meaning you got to stand on your own now. You're either going to step up and do the right thing or you're not. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, tachon zchut avot. The merit of the patriarchs still gives mercy. But Reish Lakish says, Tav is the last letter of the seal of the Holy Blessed One. And what is the seal of God? Emet, truth. Right? The Tav is there to say, who are the people who really confronted and stood up for truth? And who are the people who didn't? That's the distinction. Emet, right? Challenging. The fourth thing I think this text is struggling with is the question of, to quote one of my mentors, Steve Stallman, do we want to make a difference or do we want to make a statement? Right? Are we called to object, to protest, to speak out? Is that obligation primarily about the integrity of the speaker? It doesn't matter whether you'll be effective, strict justice says. The point is your integrity. Can you stand silent watching atrocities being committed and still be a righteous person? Effectiveness is irrelevant. It's about you. That's one reading. A different reading, it's primarily about affecting change in the other. In which case, our tochacha, our protest, has to be very carefully crafted. And we need discernment, right? To know how best to be heard and whether we are the right people to bring that message. And is this the right time? And how do we do it, right? And there is a whole body of law that speaks to this. How do you give, primarily in the context of interpersonal relationships, how do you give tochacha? You do it in private. You don't do it publicly. You don't embarrass someone, right? Maimonides' Mishnah Torah has a whole body of law on this, picking up on a verse in Leviticus where we have an obligation to reprove our fellow, in the context specifically of fellow Jews, right? We don't want to embarrass someone, but we have to speak up, right? So that's that you have to be really careful. The third explanation is it is about making a difference, but it's about a wider audience than the person doing wrong. It's not just about you and your integrity. It's about making a difference in society. Because if you speak up, others will speak up. If you speak up, you contribute to a culture of truth, of righteousness, of courage. And if you don't, you contribute to the culture of the opposite. So it does make a difference, even if it doesn't change the person doing the wrong behavior. It's a different kind of difference that you are making, right, in contributing to culture this way. What I want to suggest is that the fact that the rabbis created this little sugya, this little section of the Talmud, with all of its echoes of the Exodus narrative and the Seder, is because they want to put all of those questions on the table on Pesach. They want us to struggle with that at the Seder. What are the implications of having been freed? What are our obligations to speak out about wrongdoing, not only now that we're free in the people oppressing us, but our own communities? What are our obligations, and all of these tensions that exist regarding that. Perhaps most interestingly, I think, that taking of the story inward, right? Speaking truth internally within the Jewish people about our own wrongdoing and injustice, whether in Israel or here, right? And this text suggests, we are not free to be silent for the sake of, quote, Jewish unity. That's what this text is saying. We can't. Strict justice will hold us to account. And God will change God's mind and say, you're right. They're not as righteous as I thought they were, right? We can't look away from injustice or violations of truth by whether it be fellow Jews or fellow citizens in the free society in which we live, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. We can't just turn away and say, well, terrible things are happening, but, right? We're not free to do that. Okay, so I said I would connect this to this week's Torah portion and that verse at the beginning about the offerings, right? I'm guessing that nobody has an obvious sense of how it's going to connect up, because it's not obvious at all. And here, to make this connection, I want to turn to, and as it happens, a text by the Be'er Mayim Chaim. The Be'er Mayim Chaim is a commentary by a 19th century Hasidic Rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Tyrer of Chernovitz. And I'm looking at Harry, whose beloved mother, Esther, passed away this week, who was from Chernovitz. He predated her, obviously. But the legacy is there. And he brings a commentary on this second verse of our Torah reading. And what he wants to know is, how come the verse begins in the singular? Adam ki yakriv. A person who, in the singular, brings an offering. And the verse concludes in the plural. Takrivu et korbanchem. They shall bring their offerings. What gives? And to answer that, he says, we have to look at the issue of rebuke. And he quotes another section of the Talmud that we've talked about in the past, in which Rabbi, it's from in Masechet Arachin, in which Rabbi Tarfon says, boy, I'd be surprised if anybody today knows how to accept rebuke. He says, we are not a culture where people accept criticism. Why? He says, one person says to another, take the splinter out of your teeth, and the other responds, oh yeah? Take the beam out of your eye, right? We know nothing about such a problem where people can't hear criticism and they turn it right back on the person criticizing. He said that's the world in which we live. And the Rabbi Chaim of Chernovitz takes this text and he goes in a very unusual direction. Why is it that that's a problem? What does that text mean? One says, take the splinter out of your teeth. The other one says, take the beam out of your eye. He says, it's not that we can't accept rebuke. It's the opposite. He says, Kol Yisrael guf echad. All of Israel are one body, right? And we can extend this to all human beings. We're like a body. We're an entity. And that means if we're all part of one body, pain here is felt there, and a sin committed by this limb affects the holiness of the whole body, right? My left arm can't say, I didn't do anything wrong. It was my right arm that did it, right? And my left leg isn't going to say, I'm fine. It's the right leg that's in pain. That's not how a body works, right? He says we all are analogous to different parts of the body. Some of us function as the eyes and the hands and the feet, and we can imagine, right, how that would work by the different work that we do. And the righteous, and I want to extend his teaching and say righteousness in all of us, is the head. It influences and directs the whole body. And then he takes our Talmud text, totally out of context, and he turns it on its head. And he says, one who can protest the actions of their household or their town or their world and they don't do so, he said it doesn't mean one who can protest. It means one who could erase and wipe out the sins of their household or the town or the world. How? By the power of righteousness and good deeds. It's not only about rebuke, right? We are all connected. And when righteousness happens, there's a flow of righteousness and holiness that flows to the whole body. And if there's enough of it, it wipes out the sin. There's a different path to responding to what's happening, and both are important. One is you call it out, you rebuke. The other is oseh ma'aseh hatov. You do good things. You do goodness in the world. And that brings holiness to the whole generation, right? And he says that's why our Torah verse says Adam ki yakriv. Adam, not Ish. Lots of words for person, right? Adam refers to all of humanity. That's why. Humanity as a whole includes everyone. Equivalent in this theology to the tzaddik. The tzaddik influences everybody. And if the tzaddik, if righteousness, if the head encompassing all the limbs draws near to God in holiness and purity, and the power of a kavanah, of intention, to be close to God, then that elevates all. And then, in plural, takrivu, we will all draw near. We will all be closer to God, right? So now we have a very, very expansive reading of this little text about the Talmud, about the mission of the Pesach Seder, right? It's the question of when we stand up, right? And it's not, and protest evil. And it's also dafka about doing good. The righteous could have erased. They could have overwhelmed the evil by all the acts of goodness and holiness. And so both are necessary. The protest against injustice, calling each other to account when we are looking the other way at evil being committed within our own communities, and also affirmative acts of goodness. And regarding both, our liberation from Egypt means we are not free to indulge our helplessness or our belief in the impossibility of the good succeeding. We have to have enough, both courage and humility, to say, who knows? Maybe if I say something, or maybe if I do one more mitzvah, it will turn the tide.